Thank you all for joining us today. I'm excited to discuss the paper by Salah Sharief, The Dehumanization of Drone Warfare, where he discusses issues of international law, ethics of war, and technology in relation to killing. So Salah, you have 25 minutes. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for this honor and pleasure of discussing and presenting with my esteemed peers. My name is Salah Sharief. I'm the director of Wordsmiths, which is an online proofreading, editing, and translation company. And my PhD was completed at the University of Leeds on the same topic. And so today I'm going to discuss and present the dehumanization of drone warfare. Now, this paper addresses how drone warfare has contributed to the dehumanization and moral distancing of war and killing, resulting in greater human insecurity. So the detached nature of drones has anonymized and dehumanized the enemy, greatly diminishing the necessary psychological barriers towards killing. And the ability of drones to transcend borders with such efficiency has reduced the consequences of war, namely the risk to death, at least on one side of the conflict. Armed attack is usually and traditionally the last resort. However, it's now becoming the first resort, and the increasingly unilateral nature of such aggression, where only one side attacks, could lead to a greater frequency of such operations. So effectively, drone systems and targeted killing policies have lowered the bar for armed conflict. Now, one method to strip someone of their inalienable human rights is to deny their human status, and this is dehumanization. But what exactly is dehumanization? Dehumanization is the denial of someone's human status, to negate their identity as a human being. Now, the principles of morality are often deemed unnecessary, and restraints against killing are weakened as a result of this dehumanization. For example, Yoshio Toshua was a Japanese veteran, and he describes how he was ordered to bayonet unarmed Chinese civilians in the Nanking massacre of 1937. He says, if I thought of them as human beings, I couldn't have done it. But I thought of them as animals or below human beings. Similarly, the US soldier, an ex-drone operator, Stephen Green, raped and killed a 14-year-old girl by the name of Abir al-Janabi. He then burnt her body alive and burnt her entire family's bodies. And when the judge asked him, when he was being trialed for this massacre, for this crime, and the judge asked him, he didn't ask him, why did you do this? He said, how? How could you do this? How could you possibly do such an abhorrent act? And he said, I couldn't do this to a human being. But Iraqis are not human. And so really we hit the crux of the matter of the tragic consequence of dehumanization. Now, Nick Haslam, he differentiates varying types of dehumanization. The most apparent form of dehumanization is called animalistic dehumanization. And this is where we degrade someone to the level of an animal. And this is usually accompanied by emotions of contempt and disgust. This is most commonly found in genocides such as the Holocaust, where the Jews were referred to as vermin, or the Rwandan genocide, where the Tutsis were referred to as inyenzi, cockroach. And the reason why we dehumanize is because as human beings, we are naturally averse to killing and torture. And that's why we develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a byproduct of the trauma that we face. Now have a look at this statistic. In World War II, only 15 to 25% of soldiers who had the opportunity to engage their weapons chose to shoot. The fact that over 75% of soldiers refused to shoot after having had the opportunity demonstrates quite aptly humanity's resistance towards killing. So dehumanization is used as a tool to allow us to commit these acts. It was said, even Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the highest ranking Nazi officials, even Adolf Eichmann was sickened when he toured the concentration camps, that he organized himself. But to participate in mass murder, all he had to do was sit at a desk and shuffle papers. And so another type of dehumanization is called mechanistic dehumanization. This is this is accompanied by indifference and a lack of empathy. And in this case, we act so mechanically that we become indifferent to someone else's existence. And the issue here is not that we consider someone as less than human. The issue is that we do not consider them at all. And this form of dehumanization is more akin to the detachment developed by killing from a distance. That being said, there is a possibility of one type of dehumanization developing into another. Just like the example of Stephen Green, who began as a drone operator, and we saw the tragic consequence of his indifference towards human life. As Richard Evans famously said, the road to Auschwitz was built by hate, but paved by indifference. And so many of the genocides, of the atrocities and killings throughout human history, they were carried out by people who would consider themselves ordinarily as good and decent. And so the question arises as to how someone who can consider themselves to be good can also be willing to commit acts of cruelty of their own free will. And so allow me to discuss with you an experiment, a well-known experiment. However, I will summarize for those who have not heard of Stanley Milgram, who was a Yale psychologist, and he sought to find the answer to this question of how ordinarily good people can commit such atrocities. So following Eichmann's trial, in 1961, he conducted an experiment. And so he gathered subjects to ask a series of questions to a student. At the order of a scientist, posing as an expert, the subject would administer electric shocks every time the student would get an answer wrong. Now, both the scientist and the student were actors, but the subjects didn't know. So the teacher in this equation is the subject at hand. The first shock that was administered was 15 volts, which is minor discomfort. And the final shock was an excruciating 450 volts. Milgram was researching obedience to authority. That was the name of his book. And he found that 100% of the participants continued until at least 300 volts because they were obeying an authority. And that was his premise. That was the premise of his thesis. However, he also found that the further away the subjects were, the more pain they were willing to inflict. And this is the subject of interest for my thesis. There were 4 iterations of the same experiment. In the first version, the subject was in another room, so they couldn't hear nor see them. The complaints of the students and moans were transcribed onto a screen. In this iteration, 65% of subjects continued until the very end. In the second experiment, voice feedback was introduced. So a mic was attached to this the participant, and the moans can be heard. In this iteration, 62.5% of people continued until the very end. So a 2.5% decrease was found when the subject at hand could hear the pain and suffering caused. However, in the third iteration, the victim was placed in the same room as the subject. So every struggle could be seen, every moan, every grimace can be witnessed. Only 40% of people continued until the very end. And in the fourth and final experiment, touch proximity was introduced, where the subject was ordered to personally place their hand on the victim's hand onto the electric node after a certain point. Only 30% of people continued until the very end. So from 65% to 62.5% to 40 to 30, we can see a dramatic decline, especially when visual proximity was introduced. And one of the subjects, referring to the remote condition, the first condition, he recalls, he says, "It's funny how you really begin to forget that there's anyone out there, even though you can hear him, even though you can see, and he's referring to the typed messages. For a long time, I just concentrated on pressing the switches and reading the words. And so when the victim is remote, the subject is more likely to compartmentalize his actions, to segment, to separate. In other words, it's more difficult for the subject to see a connection between his actions and the consequence for the victim, because there is a physical separation between the act and the effects. A leaver is depressed, and in one room and in another room, cries are heard. There is correlation, but the correlation is not complete. Now, this is where the role of distance comes into it. Ben Charlotte, he notes that increasing the distance between combatants allows for an increase in the degree of aggression. Psychological and physical distances are often interlinked, and one can lead to the other. When we're psychologically detached, we can more easily become physically detached, and likewise, when we're physically detached, we can very easily become psychologically detached. A clear link is made between the distance of the kill and the subsequent trauma, or lack thereof, to the attacker. So when killing in the vicinity of your enemy, you hear their screams, you see the blood, and you remember your foe's last utterance, as described by numerous survivors of war. And this intense connection makes it so much more difficult to kill. In many cases, it becomes an obstacle to kill, but perhaps that's a necessary obstacle to avoid killing. Colonel Barry Bridger of the US Army, the US Air Force, he describes the difference between air combat and ground battle. He says, you see the aircraft, you see a target on the ground, but you're not eyeball to eyeball with the sweat and emotions of combat. And so it doesn't become so emotional for you or personalized. And I think it's easy to do that in that sense. You're not so affected. Now, as the distance between combatants increases, both physically and psychologically, we can measure a direct correlation between the distance and the emotions exhibited as a result. An RAF crew described the scenes in 1943, 20,000 feet above the ground level, immediately after bombing the city of Hamburg. They said, I saw no streets, no outlines of buildings, only bright fires which flared like yellow torches against a background of bright red ash. Above the city was a misty red haze. I looked down, fascinated, yet aghast, satisfied, yet horrified. And so that wording of that last sentence is particularly noteworthy to me. There's a juxtaposition between fascinated and aghast, satisfied and horrified. The crew were not close enough to see each individual death, but they were close enough to imagine the consequence of their actions. Close enough to be horrified, but far enough to enjoy a level of satisfaction. And since then, technology has developed exponentially. And the same level of damage can be achieved without ever seeing the extent of the damage firsthand. And this is where technology comes into it. Because a direct correlation can be made between resistance to killing and physical distance to the target. Hand-to-hand combat exhibits the most resistance, followed by knife crime, followed by shooting someone with a gun, followed by a rifle, by a sniper, by a bomb. And drone warfare can be placed all the way to the right of this graph. And the problem with what we call distance is that technology now has the ability to exercise different forms of access without others. So for example, imagine you're looking at someone thousands of miles away through a camera. Because this is the argument given by drone operators, is that you can see your enemies, although you cannot actually see them and it's a silhouette. However, to an extent, you can track your enemies. However, just imagine, you're looking at someone thousands of miles away through a camera, perhaps a CCTV camera. You are now simultaneously near and far. You're close and you're distant, depending on your perception of the word. If you can see the other person, and if there's a microphone, you can perhaps hear them too, but you cannot touch them. Do you share a presence with that person? Physical distance, thanks to technology, no longer necessarily implies perceptual distance. A distinction therefore needs to be made between presence and access. You can access someone without being present. Now, to be co-present with someone else, two living entities must be accessible to one another. Each entity must have the ability to affect one another. Looking at someone through a camera thousands of miles away does not meet the conditions of co-presence. Firstly, you cannot affect them. But more importantly, they cannot see, hear, or touch you. And perhaps they are not even aware of your existence. So not only is the accessibility limited, it's only one way. And this is vital. Because the more senses present, the more multidimensional and intense the presence becomes. When two armies are traditionally, since the dawn of mankind, when two armies are present physically, they are coexistent. Only when they are within reach of one another on the battlefield are they co-present. And so the breakthrough of drone technology has created a situation where one side has access to the other, but the access is not reciprocal. A drone operator concedes in a transcript. In an official transcript, a drone operator says, "There's no flesh on your monitor, only coordinates." An Israeli tank gunner, he recalls, he says, "You see it as if it is happening on a TV screen. I don't see people, and that's one good thing about it." When asked how it feels to kill someone through a TV screen, some operators replied, "Oh, it's a gamer's delight. It's almost like playing the computer game Civilization, in which you direct units in armies into battle." Some even showed enjoyment, saying, "It's like a video game. It can get a little bloodthirsty, but it's effing cool." Now, this extreme boredom results in an eagerness for action. Any activity is sought to kill the boredom. Situated in a base 45 minutes from Las Vegas, watching a village in Afghanistan, one pilot remarks, disappointingly, he says, I was hoping we could make out a rifle. Never mind. The sensor operator replies, "That truck would make a beautiful target." 2 hours later, someone enters the room asking, "What's the master plan, fellas?" To which the pilot responds, "I don't know. I hope we get to shoot the truck with all the dudes in it." Now, such quotes are a stark contrast to the horrors of war described by foot soldiers on the ground. Now, one such example is William Manchester, who was a US soldier turned author, and he recalls. He says, "I shot him with a 45 and I felt remorse and shame. I can remember whispering foolishly, 'I'm sorry,' and then throwing up. I threw up all over myself. It was a betrayal of what I'd been taught as a child." And the ironic element is that these technological advances were designed to allow us to kill more accurately and thus more humanely. However, the development of these weapons is arguably making us behave and allowing us to behave much less humanely. The development of this technology is leading to a unilateral form of warfare. Lieutenant Colonel David Benham from the US Air Force, he notes, he says, "It's possible that in our lifetime we will be able to run a conflict without ever leaving the United States." And so as a result, efforts are not made to immobilize the enemy, but rather locate and eradicate. And so traditional battle evolves into manhunting. And the strategy of militarized manhunting is essentially preventative. And we are now entering an era of preventative warfare, of preemptive self-defense. Gregory Chamayou, he adds, warfare, from being possibly asymmetrical, becomes absolutely unilateral. What could still claim to be combat is converted into a campaign of what quite simply taught slaughter. And so the fact that one may engage in warfare with no possibility of being harmed changes the nature of armed aggression, as well as the mentality of those conducting the war. Now, such weaponry is described as godlike, not only by the critics, but by the weapon manufacturers themselves. And now weapon manufacturers are using monikers derived from ancient mythology. The US military research agency, DARPA, is currently building a drone with 92 cameras called Argus, an omniscient figure in Greek mythology with 100 eyes. The Sierra Nevada Corporation have created a video capture technology, which is a spherical array of 9 cameras attached to an aerial drone. It's called the Gorgon Stare, named after a figure, again, in Greek mythology, that turns onlookers into stone. They aimed their whole surveilling operation an ever-watchful eye. Now, the promoters of drones boast of these machines have revolutionized our ability to provide a constant stare against our enemy. And this constant stare has been the result of PTSD to thousands of people living in those countries who can constantly hear the sound of a drone whizzing over them. US Colonel Theodore Oski, he describes it, and he says it's like having a god overhead, as lightning comes down in the form of a hellfire. And a drone operator admitted that he felt like a god hurling thunderbolts from afar. Now, the fact that these drones can transcend borders so seemingly demands extra scrutiny, because it blurs the line between war and peace. They transform the social context of war, something considered traditionally as the supreme sacrifice. Loss of life has now become a distant, secretive process of robotic strikes against an unknown kill list. So armed conflict is being transformed from a fixed territory over a limited period of time to a boundless scope over an indefinite period of time. And so I end on one note. It was reported that when the Iraq war commenced, a computer program was devised by the US government called the Bug Splat program, which approximated how many civilians would die in a particular bombing raid. On the opening day of the war, it was estimated that 22 of the planned bombing attacks would provide a heavy bug splat. And a heavy bug splat is defined as over 30 civilian deaths per attack. General Tommy Franks said, "Go ahead, we're going ahead, we're doing all 22. And so I remind us of one of the first examples I gave of the infamous Rwandan genocide, where the Tutsis were referred to as Inyenzi, cockroach. A secret military operation began against the Tutsis called Operation Intesticide. And so while I acknowledge the difference in dehumanization between the two, I hope this research serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of dehumanization and the impact it has on our own humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salah. That gave us a lot to think about. I hope all of you have lots of questions. I'm going to give about 10 to 15 minutes of comments. Salah, don't worry too much about writing everything down. I've got a lot of in-text comments, as well as some notes that I will send you afterwards. So, in your paper, The Dehumanization of Drone Warfare, you set to explain the issue of dehumanization and its impact on armed conflict. You discuss the role of technology, in particular drones and UAVs, in exacerbating the issue of detachment and dehumanization. And you conclude that by virtue of physical and psychological distancing, drones dehumanize and anonymize the enemy, leading to a reduced resistance to killing, and in turn, a greater willingness to engage in low-intensity operations of armed conflict globally. Finally, you argue that UAVs or drones ought to be strictly limited to official and legally recognized armed conflicts. You offered both in your paper and in your discussion today a compelling discussion of legal, psychological, and ethical insight into the dilemmas of killing by remote control. You discussed the difference between animalistic dehumanization and mechanistic dehumanization, contrasting the language of Bush in Iraq with the opening bug splat, and Obama with his drone wars, and the discussion of drone operators. You utilized the classic Stanley Milgram psychological experiments to discuss detachment and distance as epitomized by the drone, and ultimately argue that drones lowered the threshold, both psychologically and politically, to engage militarily abroad. There are a few main arguments of your paper that I'd like to push you to explore more in depth and complicate your thinking a little bit. First and foremost, I would like you to be clear about the real distinction between distancing and anonymization that takes place between traditional fighter-bomber pilots and drone pilots. You argue that drone pilots are more distant than traditional bomber pilots, but is this really the case? You cite the British RAF bomber pilot in your talk today, who was both in awe and disgust of the destruction he caused up in Hamburg, Germany, and contrast that with drone pilots who believe that killing is like a video game. I really like the fact that you engage with direct quotes from military service members. I think this is the most powerful way to convey your message and to counter the dehumanizing language with these concrete examples that evoke emotion in all of us as we hear them. I wonder, however, if many of these quotes are somewhat selective to support your conclusions. There are quotes from bomber pilots who are far more psychologically distanced from killing than drone pilots, who often have to witness the killing close up, even if they're at a distance. Is the risk asymmetry, the fact that drone pilots are safely operating abroad, and that theoretically bomber pilots could still be shot down, enough to explain these differences? So I'd like you to dig a little bit deeper into this contrast, because I think this is the toughest challenge to your argument, and one that needs to be better explored, the difference between drone pilots and traditional bomber pilots. So along those lines, I think that your discussion of drone pilot narratives might be somewhat selective, and that it emphasizes the dehumanization and distancing of the other. There's been some new work published in recent years, a book by Peter Lee called Reaper Force, and a book by Lindsay Clark called Gender and Drone Warfare, which I think would further complicate your argument a bit. I think you ought to recognize that drones have an inherent tension, which is characterized by John Williams of Durham University as a distant intimacy, which is both killing at a distance safely in risk asymmetry and killing visually up close. This is especially true as drone pilots do battle damage assessments after Hellfire missile strikes. Let me offer you some operator quotes from Lindsay Clark's book, just for you to think through and contrast a little bit. So one drone pilot said, quote, "When you hit a truck full of people, there are limbs and legs everywhere. I watched a guy crawl away from the wreckage after one shot with no lower body. He slowly died. You have to watch that. You don't get to turn away." Another drone pilot, Brandon Bryant, said, after he had struck a few individuals in a field, "The smoke clears, and there's pieces of the two guys around the crater. And there's this guy over here, and he's missing his right leg above his knee. He's holding it. He's rolling around, and the blood is squirting out of his leg, and it's hitting the ground, and it's hot. His blood is hot. But when it hits the ground, it starts to cool off. The pool cools fast. It took him a long time to die. I just watched him. I watched him become the same color as the ground he was lying on." And one more drone pilot. "I know the feeling you experience when you see someone die. Horrifying barely covers it. And when you are exposed to it over and over again, it becomes like a small video, embedded in your head, forever on repeat, causing psychological pain and suffering that many people will hopefully never experience." So I think some of these quotes will both complicate but also complement your argument of co-presence by acknowledging that it is indeed a complex phenomenon that should be studied further. Plenty of soldiers can dehumanize and psychologically distance up close on the ground, just as many drone operators can feel empathy and connection at a distance. So I want you to be wary in your argument of essentializing and really lean into these contradictions that killing presents to the human condition. So with that, I also want to say that I disagree with one of your conclusions and your point about PTSD and drone operators. You cite a 2012 Ortega piece from the Brookings Institution and say that, quote, Ortega clearly demonstrates in detail how the stress of drone operators is not likened to the PTSD of traditional soldiers. Drone operators may be stressed for whatever reason, yet the trauma is missing. And you attribute this, end quote, and you attribute this to a more day-to-day stress of workplace. There's a lot of work recently that I cite in my written comments, especially about the traumas of blurring the home front and the battlefront. And Lindsay Clark especially writes a lot about and interviewed drone pilots and their families, as well as Peter Lee. I think there is a complex relationship here whereby you are, quote unquote, at war while piloting, and then you're expected to pick up milk from the grocery store and grab your kids from football practice on the way home. A couple more quotes related to PTSD I think are helpful here from Clark's book. So, acting as an important reminder that emotional distress and psychological injury manifest in a different range of different ways. One interviewee, one drone pilot notes, quote, mine is more of a traumatic memory. I don't have enough ticks in the boxes to be full PTSD. I was on tablets, antidepressants for 2-3 months. So indicating that even though he was not classed as full PTSD, the results can still be debilitating and require medical and psychological interventions. Furthermore, Reaper crews are often exposed to disturbing images, rendered visible in 3 ways. 1, in the operational requirements for battle damage assessments, where crews have to assess the aftermath of weapon strikes. 2, an observation of the death of friendly forces or civilians. And 3, in the observation of traumatic social events that crews are not permitted to intervene in. As a result, these crews may be haunted by their experiences, becoming distantly intimate with the subjects of surveillance. So Clark writes, contrary to critics' claims that physical distance between the crews and the theater of war will lead to moral disconnect, crews are instead indicating that they are troubled by unexpected emotions, disturbed by the ghostly similarities between their lives and those of the individuals under their surveillance. So one drone pilot who spoke about his experiences of causing civilian casualties noted watching an older man coming up to the road where the bodies of the dead were covered up with a tarpaulin. Quote, he lifted the tarpaulin and looked for a few good seconds. What was he thinking? Was he praying? He bent down and lifted the body of one of the children. There were 2, and walked slowly away. The drone pilot then recounted after picking his family up from a barbecue that evening. One of the children falls asleep in the car. Quote, it wouldn't be the first time he had had to carry a sleeping child from the car into their bed. But images of an elderly Afghan carrying a child in the dark haunt him to this day. So one final example from this. After destroying one enemy vehicle, the drone pilot reflects. These 2 guys came back to inspect what happened. I felt sorry for them. I felt some association with them because my dad used to take me for drives in trucks where he used to work. I felt an affinity for them. Then we were cleared hot, and we rifled them with a Hellfire missile. They heard the sound of the missile as it approached. Then one of them threw himself on top of the other. And that's just stuck in my head. I don't know why it's affected me. I don't know if it was the affinity for my father and the truck. I believe they were father and son because of the way one threw himself on top of the other. And they were both lying there, dead. It's just something that's always stuck with me. They were men just like me. So I think after having heard these, I think we can all feel the kind of powerful emotion that comes from this narrative and understanding of the contradictions and complications of killing and war. And I think you can still draw the conclusion that you draw in this paper, that drones do affect a major distancing. But I think it would really embolden and empower your argument to recognize that these are genuine tensions worth exploring. I think you do a spectacular job of focusing on the issues of godlike technology and the problem of a video game mentality, which is no doubt pervasive with drone operators. With all of that said, I think you make a very compelling case that drones outside of declared war zones, the way the US has operated them, is very problematic both legally and ethically. You do not fall into what I view as a trap and say that drones must be outlawed or banned because they are inherently unethical. You utilize your sources of law and ethics well to demonstrate the point of complexity, that the US has attempted to expand the zone of war wherever terrorists operate, quote unquote, which has led to an immense increase of drone strikes, especially under the Obama administration. I think the recognition of these in-between spaces between war and peace and the kind of blurry nature of contemporary conflict that you especially cite in Daniel Brunstedter's work on the use of force short of war, I think it's instructive here to further help along your well-developed legal argument. In the end, this was a very engaging paper, and I hope that you will continue to work on it and expand your analysis. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I can see by the questions being posed that everyone enjoyed your discussion of it. So I hope my comments will be constructive and you will continue on this and other related projects. I'd like to open it up for Q&A now, since unfortunately our student discussant Hassan could not be here with us today.
Just before we go into the Q&A, I just wanted to really say, I'm really quite impressed and appreciate the intricacy to which you provided that feedback. That was really a breath of fresh air. And although, I guess we could continue all day, we're not for the time restraints. I could definitely utilize those quotes and those sources that you use. So yes, definitely, if you could send that to me afterwards, I think definitely that could help to mature the discussion. And while I maintain there are quite distinct differences between drone warfare and traditional aerial bombing, I think definitely, using those sources and using those quotes can paint a more mature picture of the situation. So thank you.
Of course. Since we don't have the student discussant today, if you'd like to go ahead and if you'd like 5 additional minutes to respond to anything I had to say or your thoughts on it, you can feel free, or we can go ahead and open it up to Q&A, whatever.
I guess 2 minutes wouldn't harm. And I want to preface it by saying that actually I accept what you're saying, and I accept those quotes. I would definitely like to see the dates of the sources afterwards, because I did read some arguments as to the role of the backlash towards those nonchalant quotes that I mentioned in my article, and the subsequent media backlash and the instructions that people were given to avoid such nonchalance. And so I would be interested in seeing the timeline of nonchalant quotes and disturbed quotes from the drone operators. As for the difference between drone warfare and traditional fighter bombs, there are a couple of differences, and I would say that probably the main 2 differences are that drone pilots are in complete safety, whereas those fighter bombers are still entering a war zone. They're still endangering themselves to an extent, and they're still entering a battlefield, whereas a drone operator can be sipping tea in Florida on the phone to his family while causing death and destruction across the world. And the second difference, and this is more of an institutional difference rather than each individual drone pilot, is the ease and the speed by which drone operations can be conducted. Within a matter of hours or even minutes, a decision can be made, authorized, and conducted, and dozens of lives or even hundreds of lives can be taken. as opposed to the traditional form of warfare where it may take days, weeks, or even months to get into that. And so this is the crux of the matter, where the last resort becomes the first resort, and the decision to enter into war becomes so much easier.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it definitely lowers the threshold of the resort to force and makes it easily, especially politically, when your soldiers are not at risk, to engage in places you wouldn't normally engage militarily. Yeah. All right, so we have a number of questions from the audience. The first one, Nanar Hawash, if you'd like to go first.
Thank you for this great paper. It was really a joy to read and to listen to you. I have a couple of questions and remarks. So the first one, I think you answered at the end, but I'm just going to still ask. Do you think there's a difference between what drones give to the institution, as in an easy access to an action, and between what drones actually, like the humane factor for the drone operators? Don't you think there's a bit of a difference? In a way, like maybe, as Professor John said, that a drone operator might actually see more gruesome deaths than the actual bomber. For example, a Russian Sukhoi 24 is a strategic bomber that flies so fast that the bomber, the actual pilot, doesn't see anything. He just drops the bombs and he'll be in the base, near the base when the bombs drop. He doesn't see anything. And when I compare him to a drone operator, the drone operator has to stay and see the consequences of his actions. But the dehumanization aspect in the ease they provide into allowing you to go into conflicts and to be part of conflicts without even having to move or transfer equipment and get and be under world pressure or political pressure because of your actions. We can see that in Turkey and Libya and Syria. That's how I saw it. So do you think there's a difference, or do you think that creates also further dehumanization? And second, do you think when it comes to seeing the enemy or dehumanizing the enemy, do you think there's a difference between a drone operator or who is dehumanizing the enemy on the battlefield because he has a sense of protecting his brothers in arms, and which is a sense that I felt throughout my studies, that most soldiers in the support sectors, so artillery and air force, they have a sense of protecting the soldiers that are fighting. Do you think it's a bit different than that drone operator who's going to do one killing? I think in Israel they called it mowing the lawn or something, like you can separated killings. And two very fast things. Do you think that the drone pilots are not expressing this trauma is because of the gender roles, or like the falling victim for gender roles, that you're not supposed to talk, especially if they are seen as they were described, like sipping the tea while killing someone. They're not going through any trauma, so they see themselves as less of combatants, and that's why maybe we have a bit of a flawed results. And one last thing: did you look at the ideological teachings of those operators from different countries? For example, from what I experienced, U.S. soldiers throughout the U.S.'s wars post World War II, they weren't really very moral with their enemies or the people. Like Vietnam War is just shocking. So maybe it's the ideological teachings, they differ from the US to UK to, of course, unfortunately now we can't really study, like have a full scope, because this technology is mostly in Western culture, so very, very similar thinking schools. Yes, those are my questions.
No, thank you. The image or the picture that a drone operator gets is not that of a human being. They don't see flesh. They don't see blood. Even if they describe blood, it's what's perceived as blood, right? So very often a dog is mistaken for a baby, right? A shovel is mistaken for a gun, and so these are all silhouettes. And so I still maintain to a degree they're not seeing a human being. So that's why Operation Bug Splat was, because it just looks like a bug being squashed. You can't actually see human beings. You're seeing silhouettes. And they even have, and I forget the term, it's in my research, but analysis, almost information overload, and they create patterns of analysis. And so many of the decisions they make as a drone operator is by simply tracking one particular silhouette's actions throughout the day. And if they differ greatly on one particular day, this person becomes a suspect. And if certain things are, if certain requirements are fulfilled or carried out through the actions of this particular silhouette, an attack may be authorized. And so we're no longer seeing each individual. We're just seeing silhouettes of objects moving. And so I think there's still a disconnect there. With regards to your second question about protection and brotherhood, this is almost the crux of the matter, which is there are none of like one particular drone operator. His brothers and sisters aren't in danger. He's not protecting them because there's no one on the field for him to protect. And just like the lieutenant that I quoted said that in our lifetime we can enter a war with no human interaction whatsoever. So I think this is missing. That's still a human thing to want to protect your brothers in arms. And so this is another form of detachment and dehumanization, in my opinion, because now even the motivation has now become mechanical. As for your last question with regards to ideology, then no, to be honest, I haven't looked into that. So that's actually a good point. And like you said, the research is limited, and it's becoming increasingly unilateral, which is also another issue. That being said, drone technology has now become increasingly accessible. So really, in the next 50 years, who knows? In fact, I believe Dr. Omar mentioned earlier in the day, he was discussing drone warfare, ISIS using drone warfare and guerrillas using drone warfare. And so my research really has pertained to states, primarily the US and the UK. And so it would be interesting, might be not the most appropriate word, but it will be noteworthy to see how that will transpire, the democratization of drone technology.
Thank you. Next question by Rushdie. I'll forward.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Salah, for this presentation. I think it is a controversial subject because this killing machine, which causes the so-called dehumanization, is actually made by a human in the first place. So I can say it actually makes killing easier and cleaner. As for killing somebody by poison instead of stabbing them with a knife, so the killer doesn't get some blood on the hands or the claws. So I think the level of humanity wouldn't be less, because just the type of the killing is different. And here I would prefer if we dig deep in the issue instead of dealing the surface. By the surface, I mean the killing machine, the drones, or whatever the tools or techniques are used to kill, and go first to the killing issue itself and start from there instead of just dealing with what is being used. The killing action, I mean, is the core here, regardless to the method or the way somebody may kill others. And concerning the experiments you mentioned, what some soldiers said before, I would like to ask you, let's imagine, take it from the opposite point of view, why the physical and social interaction could not decrease the killings in many other cases, but instead it caused the opposite, where the killing was much more, and it was more terrible and more criminal. Let me bring Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq after the invasion in 2003, where armed troops coming from liberal democratic countries which claims exporting human rights to the world committed criminal and terrible actions worse than the drones or any other killing machine. Though they were physically and socially in front or beside their victims, listening to their screams, to their suffering day and night, for days, for months, I don't know. This is just an example of so many examples we're witnessing today in our countries that are invaded by foreign, let's say, armies, the hegemonic powers who are attacking other people and killing them. There are still social interaction, but it doesn't look like decreasing the killing, but sometimes actually increasing it. We can look at the prisons. So I just would say at the end that I agree with you that we should criticize this, the killing machine, the way of killing, and we should have this, but at the same time we should be have some critical awareness and of the core issue, which is killing, not just come to rationalize the way we kill and the tools we use to kill, but to start from the very important issue, which is the killing action itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So there were two questions, or a two-part question. And regarding the first part, the reason why we analyze the method is because the method, the methodology, the technique, the weaponry used creates a disconnect. So that detachment, you say killing is killing and the human being is killing, but there is a disconnect between the action and the consequence. And that's really the crux of the argument, which is actions are being taken and there is a disconnect between the consequences are not comprehended as vividly as say traditional warfare, and that's the point that needs to be highlighted. With you're pressing a button, someone's dying. The cause and effect there's a distance between the cause and effect. There is a only partial correlation, whereas hand-to-hand combat is extremely vivid to both parties, and so that was the point being made. As for genocides and horrific acts in the past, that is also a form of dehumanization. So I mentioned two forms of dehumanization: animalistic dehumanization and mechanistic. And so in examples like Abu Ghraib, those people were dehumanized. And the reason why they committed such horrific acts is because they dehumanized their opponents. They referred to them as vermin, as animals, as dogs. And that's what allowed them to do such horrific acts. Now, of course, there are people who are have psychological, there are cruel people in this world that don't even need dehumanization. There are those people who sociopaths and psychopaths. But as for the normal human being, they require tools such as dehumanization to commit these acts. And so in examples like Abu Ghraib, those people were dehumanized. And so that is called animalistic dehumanization. And the example of drone warfare is mechanistic dehumanization. And I conceded already in the presentation and in the article that animalistic dehumanization is worse. Of course, it's worse than mechanistic dehumanization. However, the point of the article and the PhD itself was to shed light upon this creeping method of dehumanization where we are becoming detached from our enemies. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, and just to highlight Salah's point, is that especially in this mechanistic dehumanization, it's portrayed as drone warfare being inherently more ethical, right? It's an ethical end unto itself. So I'm going to move on now to some of the questions in the Q&A. So I'll give you kind of two at a time for you to answer, Salah. So first question, do you think the future of drone warfare will be developed to be worse, and how? And second question, what do you think were the very first seeds in history that gave birth to the current state where we have reached a point of killing without being affected psychologically?
Okay, thank you. Now, do I think the future of drone warfare will be developed to be worse? The issue right now is that the technology is advancing at a quicker rate than the law itself. So the technology is not being regulated, and that's the issue. And so there are loopholes in international law being created. That's why one of my suggestions is to limit drone warfare to official acts of armed conflict, because the lines of war and peace are being blurred. And so traditionally, you need to be, you cannot attack another nation without being in a war. Now you need to make an official declaration of war. That has not been done for many years now. Now we're going to armed conflicts, not into wars. However, you still need to have an official armed conflict. Now, the unprecedented nature of drone warfare is that attacks are being made in times of peace due to the ease and the speed at which they're being deployed. And so you can receive news of a potential attack, and without even having time to verify, without even having time to fact check, you have the ability to deploy a mini attack, a single drone. Perhaps 5 or 6 people will be killed preemptively, and the drone returns, and no official armed conflict was created. And so we have a loophole where you can attack legally because it's not an official attack. And this is the issue: is that when those laws were created, they were created in the 20th century. So international law was created in the 20th century with 20th century traditional modes of conflict. Now, this technology does not represent the context upon which those laws were created. And so the future of drone warfare will be worse if it's not regulated. Those laws need to be updated. Those laws need to be adjusted in order to regulate them. And of course, there's the issue of enforceability and how you can enforce those laws. So if these things can be done, if the laws can be adjusted in line with this technology, and if the law can keep up with the technological advancements, and if we can find a way to enforce them, then we can definitely curb the effects of drone warfare. However, in absence of that, then yeah, it most certainly definitely will get worse. And they're creating drones now far more technologically advanced. They're currently creating drones the size of mosquitoes that can kill each individual person. And there is even talk of these drones being untraceable. And so we're entering into a whole new world, to be honest. As for the second question, what do you think the very seeds of history, the very seeds in history, we can't create a rosy picture of history where there was no violence until drones have existed. And so, warfare and killing has existed in human history since the dawn of mankind. However, the difference being argued here is that it's always been the last resort. War is the last resort. Negotiation, talking, peace. These are all steps before war. And so I think with the advancement of technology, this is the first seed where technology has developed exponentially. In the last 50 years, technology has developed more than in the last 5,000 years, which is unfathomable. And so there's a disconnect between the norms of society, the laws of society, and the agreements of society, and the advancements of technology. And I think that's now the catalyst that has created the situation that we're in.
Yeah, this is a point that Salah really comes out in the paper, that the focus has become on perfecting the means of war and neglecting the ends of war. Instead of what are you fighting for, what are your mechanisms and goals you want to achieve, it's just perfecting the technology in order to kill more efficiently, right? And that really comes out in this paper. So next question, I'm only going to do one because it'll be a quick answer, and the next one is quite long. Have you thought about drawing a linkage between video games and dehumanization, especially with the recent events in New Zealand?
Yes, however, to be quite frank, it's out of the scope of the research, and so I'm definitely interested in such research being made. However, you know, a PhD is 100,000 words, and that sounds a lot. However, you know, I had to limit it towards law and politics.
Always have to keep it more and more narrow to keep the PhD advisors happy. All right, next question. Many support the use of drones, claiming it puts less American soldiers in harm's way and kills fewer civilians than the alternative. Most argue that drones are effective militarily. Drones can strike an impassable terrain, fly over enemy territory, and need to refuel less than manned jets. Training drone controllers is faster and significantly cheaper than training pilots. Future drones may be more effective than traditional fighter jets, as they will be able to avoid radar detection, gain hyper maneuverability, etc. This said, do you think that you have missed some of the relatively good side of using drones? Do you think there are good sides to using drones?
All of those things are correct, and all of those things are good. But can you notice the crux of the situation is that all those things are good for one side of the conflict, and that's the point. And after the Vietnam War, public perception is now number one, the number one priority for states. Before the war in Vietnam, perhaps you can say the majority of the population are unaware of the atrocities that go on. However, after the creation of mass media, after the Vietnam War, now people are not happy having their own governments creating such atrocities. And so this is one of the main reasons why drone technology was developed in the first place. So all those things are excellent reasons for the attacking side. However, you know, the whole point is that as humanity, we have a responsibility to think about both sides, to think about everyone. And so for every good argument being made, this is now another knife in the back of those victims who are now being killed with impunity because they are cheaper, because drones are cheaper to make, because the drone operators can be trained more easily, because the American or British troops are no longer in range. We now have permission to kill unarmed civilians. And so this is the idea, this is the point, is that it is indeed easier, and all these good aspects of drone warfare are what needs to be regulated.
Perfect. We have one question from social media that I'd like to pose to you. So would you highlight what methodology you have followed in your paper? Is there any quantitative tool that helped answering any relational hypotheses on the unethical and immorality of drone use? In what ways does...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the methodology, any quantitative tools that you've used in the hypothesis of unethical and immorality of drone use. The next part, in what ways does your research contribute to established literature, both pro and against the use of drone warfare? And would your research contribute in any way to the international law and encouragement towards illegalizing the use of drones? So making the use of drones illegal.
Okay, so the methodology was qualitative. It was doctrinal and socio-legal, and so I did not venture into, due to practical reasons, namely that I have to enter war zones, and I don't think the University of Leeds would sanction such a trip to Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, or Iraq, and so I had to utilize secondary research. So thankfully, many organizations have made those, Omni International and NGOs, similar NGOs, they've made the statistics, they've gone out and they've done that statistical analysis, that quantitative analysis. And so I use a socio-legal and doctrinal methodology, and I relied on that. As for the third question of argument for and against the illegalization of drones, now I don't make an argument to illegalize drones for two reasons. One is practically, drones are not going anywhere, and so I try to avoid being too idealistic to the extent where the research is of no benefit and it's purely theoretical or hypothetical, and I try to make it at least realistic to an extent that it could perhaps be implemented. And so I don't have the exact statistics in my head now, but in my research I mentioned the exponential rate to which funding is being made into the drone. And so we're talking about billions of dollars a year being spent on drone technology. And so it's not going to go anywhere. And secondly, I don't argue that drones are inherently immoral. In fact, they are more accurate. They are more humane. So a drone in and of itself is more humane than a bomb because it's more accurate. The arguments I make are that when they are left unregulated, they can then cause more harm. And I keep repeating the speed and ease by which they can be used. They're blurring the lines between one piece. And so my arguments are pertaining to regulation, that they should be limited to official. And to be honest, if this was enacted and drones were limited to official official instances of armed conflict, you will see an exponential drop in the use of drones. Why? Because you have to think twice. Because now the state would say we have to erode these national ties or these international ties that we have with a certain country and enter into an official armed conflict in order to pursue this attack. You will see them become more creative and exert more effort into less violent solutions. And so that's my argument, not to illegalize the drones, however, to create more regulation.
Okay, two more questions from the Q&A. So first one, do you think that it is now the laws or human ethics are to be blamed for the state of dehumanization in relation to drone war? And second, do you suggest eliminating drones can make killing more difficult, therefore decreasing it eventually? Or are you suggesting that we should regulate its use? I think you kind of answered that one, but if you'd like to expand on it.
Sure. I'm not sure if I understand the first question entirely. However, I can touch on that topic. And I think that the focus on, like John said quite succinctly actually, is that the focus is on the means rather than the ends, and the laws don't reflect the human ethics involved. So the idea, one of the ideas behind the PhD was to try and create and instill some humanization into those laws. And so the issue that I have is the culture of international law, and the culture of armed conflict right now is devoid of those ethics. And so I think the issue here is that you can follow the letter of the law without following the spirit of the law. And so that's why I think extra regulation is needed. And that answers the second question. If we did eliminate drones, then yes, it would decrease it eventually, but I don't think that's practical. I don't think that's possible. And it's not necessarily required. And so I advocate regulation.
We have another question from Nanar. Go ahead. You're muted.
It's a two-part question. So it's relating to the comment that you had, that the laws are way behind the technology. which is I agree with. My question is, do you think that laws are lacking behind for a reason? Do you think that they're lacking behind because drone usage has been, up to recent years, exclusive to the Western sphere or to a certain like allies? And in relation to add to this question, do you think that law will catch up as opposing players are catching up, like Russia and China, and even regional players like Turkey and Iran? No.
That's a very good point, actually, because, you know, my argument is, you know, it takes years and years for laws to be drafted, to create soft law followed by hard law, to create conventions and treaties. And time again, we see, you know, for example, those who have war criminals who have conducted massacres being trialed on their 99th birthday, a few moments before their own death, because it takes so long for these laws and for these political red tape to be enacted. However, it will be very interesting, as you're implying, that once this democratization of drones and drone technology proliferates, that perhaps now we will suddenly see some laws being enacted. And so I couldn't say, you know, it would just be a guess at this point, but that's a very good point. And to be honest, let's see. Now that more nations will have drones, let's see if we suddenly now have the creativity and cut through the red tape to create these laws. However, as a side note, the enforceability of said laws, it remains a problem. How would you enforce these international laws to begin with?
Okay, a couple final questions. So what method do you use for interpreting the representation and like imaging of drone warfare? So the understanding, you talked a lot about how kind of visual technology is improving, and yet it's also just a silhouette of the individual, and that we often target patterns of life rather than individuals per se. And for you, the individual image in our time as concept deserves a syncological or communicative analysis. So understanding the different methods of analysis for understanding these images, I guess, is the crux of that question.
Apologies, I didn't quite understand the questions. As for the first question, I believe I've answered that. Is socio-legal and doctrinal methodology. Studies have been conducted on those, and as secondary research, I use them as per my analysis. And I'm apologies, I didn't quite get the second question.
I believe it's my fault. My French is not good, so poor Malika had to do English for me. So I guess I have one final question, and then if anyone else wants to raise their hand, we can do that because we still have a few minutes left. But throughout your paper, you discuss kind of the idea of pinpoint strikes, improved accuracy, surgical strikes. And it seems to me as though sometimes you're almost slipping into the language of precision and cleanliness that you're trying to push back against with dehumanization. So I often find myself doing it all the time because it's so prevalent in the discussion of drones. And I know at points in the paper you acknowledge there are major issues, assuming one's combatant status based on patterns of life, etc. Mm-hmm. Yet at other places you utilize this distinct language. So I'm wondering to what effect the way in which it's framed by the proponents of drone warfare actually impacts us that are trying to do critical research on it in the language that they use. How much do we have to give in order to be heard versus how much do we focus on other elements to push back against it? I'm wondering how you kind of grapple with that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, to be honest, because you know, without this being brought up by peers and colleagues, you could just fall into that same trap. So I actually I'm not sure whether it's in the chapter that the paper that I've presented or in a different chapter in the PhD, but I mention the dehumanization of language, especially employed by the Obama administration, and how language is used as a tool. And so, for example, killings become operations, and of course, an operation is operation is conducted by a surgeon, which is an inherently positive thing, and victims are termed the term slips my mind, but the point being that the dehumanization of language is used. And so basically, to answer the question, I feel perhaps we need to engage with the terminology used while placing a caveat and whilst prefacing that, or perhaps through footnotes or through in-depth explanation, that these terms themselves are problematic. They've been used for the purpose of the research. However, the reader should note that there is an inherent problem with them.
Perfect. Do we have any final questions from the audience that is here with us right now? Anyone like to chime in for a last question?
I would, speaking of the precision part, I always wondered, is the sword missile, you definitely have heard of it, right? Do you think it was created because of pushback from like-minded thinkers like you and Professor John? Is it that you need to is it created because of that, or is it for other operative reasons?
To be honest, I don't have the answer to that, but it would definitely be interesting to research that and find that answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's only been reported recently. Apparently, instead of a Hellfire missile explosion, they have essentially swords and knives come out, so it only kills the people in the car. Because I think there was a lot of pushback from NGOs and others like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, where these are anti-tank munitions. So if you're targeting 3 people in a field, they have a wide kill and injure radius. So I think that might have been both strategic in the sense that you only want to kill who you're actually targeting to not have, collateral damage, as they like to put it. But it's hard to say what drives the American military mind.
Okay.
Any other final questions? All right. I just want to remind all of the audience that here in Zoom and in social media that tomorrow's sessions are on the subject of political theory and economics and finance. So there's a really great lineup of a lot of great papers. So please be sure to tune in tomorrow. I want to say thank you so much to Salah Sharief. It's a fantastic paper. He wrote a fantastic PhD, and it really gave me a lot to think about, even though I've been studying this for a long time. So thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you to all of the audience members, both here in Zoom and in social media, for joining us today.